While the Supreme Court has declared Terry stops, the more legally accurate term for stop, question, frisk, constitutional, that doesn't mean that all ways police departments might practice Terry stops are constitutional. If, for example, a police department were more likely to stop blacks than whites engaged in similar behaviors, that would be a violation of the 14th Amendment's equal protection guarantee. But unless you've got smoking gun evidence of racist intent, often the only way to demonstrate a 14th Amendment violation is to use statistics to detect evidence of discrimination in the ways in which a department practices Terry stops. But that's easier said than done because of what's known as the problem of the denominator. Let me give an example. Let's say, on a particular night, a police officer stops and frisks 5 African Americans and 5 whites. And that would be a very, very busy night for an NYPD officer. In 2011, the peak year for Terry stops in the NYPD, officers made an average of 2 such stops a month. Is this officer stopping blacks at a higher rate than whites? It's impossible to know because we don't know how many of each group the officer encountered that night. Change the number of each group an officer encounters, and we get very different results. Let's say the officer encountered 5 African Americans that night and 10 whites. In that case, the officers stopped 100% of the African Americans they encountered and only 50% of the whites. And that difference in percentages at least suggests there's discrimination in this officer's application of stop and frisk, even if on its own, this evidence wouldn't be definitive. But if we reverse the numbers of each group the officer encounters, while keeping the number of stops of each group the same, we get very different percentages. Even though the number of both blacks and whites stopped are exactly the same, if we change the denominator, the officer has stopped 50% of the blacks they encountered, but 100% of the whites. In this scenario, the numbers suggest there's at least the possibility of police bias against whites. Same number of stops of blacks and white, but very different outcomes. So how do we know how many of each social group the officer encountered? The answer is we don't and can't. So what statisticians do is try to come up with something that can be a substitute for what they don't know. Statisticians call such a substitute a proxy. One such proxy is the US Census. We can look to see how many blacks and whites live in a certain geographical area according to the census. This is what's known as a census benchmark, because we are benchmarking the number of stops of each group relative to their share of the census population. But all benchmarks have problems, and the census benchmark has a real one. Police officers don't conduct Terry stops on the census. They conduct Terry stops on individuals. So what matters for knowing the denominator is who is out on the street and potentially subject to a stop, question, frisk by an officer. That population is often called the available population. But the available population at any hour might not be the same as the census population. Think about your own neighborhood. Who is out at 3 p.m. might be very different than who is out at 3 a.m. And most Terry stops happen in the late night and early morning hours. In short, a census benchmark might be very different than the available population. And so any analysis of racial disparities based on a population benchmark, argue many, is unreliable. Just how unreliable is somewhat hard to know, but we've got some good evidence. Although no one has studied New York City to see how large the gap is between the census and the available population, scholars have studied London, since England has something very much like Terry stops and similar concerns about potentially biased policing. London is also in many ways like New York, a large global city with a diverse population and significant economic inequality. The British Home Office, that's the ministry responsible for policing, set out in 2002 to discover what the population mix was on streets at different hours in order to test the reliability of using a census benchmark. The research method was to drive a van around streets and then, using a video camera, record the ethnic mix of the street. Of course, that methodology relies on the observer's judgment about the ethnicity of those in the video, which might not match that individual's self-identification. But the methodology does mirror officers' reliance on visual perception as well when concluding whom to stop. So ultimately, the use of observer-defined ethnicity may actually be reasonably well suited to this issue. The Home Office concluded that the available population was very different than the census population, what they call the resident population. The Home Office further concluded that once the available population was compared to the ethnic mix of those stopped, there was no clear bias by the police. Now, that the Home Office found little bias by officers in London doesn't tell us much one way or the other about how New York police, or police more broadly in the country, go about their jobs. But that the census and the available population were so different does strongly suggest the dangers of using a population benchmark. A second proxy that scholars use is a criminal participation benchmark. This benchmark compares Terry stops of various racial groups not to their census numbers, but to each group's share of the criminally active population. But how do we know the racial mix of those committing crimes? Concluding who commits crimes from arrest statistics raises the possibility that those numbers might reflect whom the police choose to arrest, rather than who chooses to commit crimes, and so could be skewed by police bias. Instead, the criminal participation benchmark looks at the racial and ethnic makeup of suspects as identified by victims, not the police. And for violent crimes, at least in New York City, victims, and sometimes witnesses, are able to provide a racial identification of the suspect somewhere between 8 and 9 times out of 10. And because most violent crime gets committed within groups, these identifications are usually within rather than across racial groups. Here, for example, is the racial makeup of victims and suspects for shootings in New York City in 2022. When statisticians use this benchmark, they are arguing that as long as the police aren't stopping individuals from a certain racial or ethnic group out of proportion to their share of the criminally active population, there's no evidence of discrimination. But like the population benchmark, there's a real problem with this benchmark as well. Since the vast majority of any racial group don't commit crimes, why should we use the extent of criminal participation by a small share of that group to decide when there's prejudice? So rather than a slam dunk process, figuring out statistically if there's bias in police stops requires using a benchmark, and each benchmark comes with different weaknesses.